Hello and welcome to the latest in my video series, Introduction to International Relations. As promised in my previous video, I'm going to try over the next few weeks to upload a video every week, time permitting. As you are aware, I am a university lecturer, in international relations. That's my day job. And I am currently, teaching has just resumed at my current institution, and I'm currently delivering a module, an introductory module to my first year undergraduate students, entitled Understanding International Relations. That module basically is primarily an introduction to IR theory, and again, as promised in the previous video, what I'm going to try to do each week, the material that I cover with my students, I'm also going to try to upload that material as a video and share that with my YouTube audience as well. So essentially, we're starting off this week with just a few kind of basic concepts, and then in subsequent weeks each week we'll look at a different paradigm, a different theoretical paradigm on international relations. So this week's video will be quite brief, because much of the stuff I covered with the students this week we've already covered here in one of the previous videos, in the Introduction to International Relations Theory video. So there's no point rehashing all of that. But I just wanted to kind of start off by just reiterating a few of the really core concepts that I went through with the students in class this week, and again from next week then we'll get on to international relations theory proper. So this week the main concepts that we covered in class are related to the idea of the sovereign state, what we call the Westphalian nation state, linked to this the idea of state sovereignty, and also the concept of anarchy in the international system. So all of these are very foundational concepts. If you want to understand international relations, these are foundational concepts that you need to understand from the outset. So we started off by talking about states as one of the key actors in international relations. So of course we have to recognise from the beginning that international relations is not solely about nation states. The emphasis, certainly in the early days of IR as an academic discipline, the emphasis was very much on relationships between states and relationships between the governments of those states. And again, the very name of the discipline, international relations, implies that. But nowadays, increasingly, there is a recognition that IR deals with global politics more broadly and with a much kind of broader and more diverse range of actors than just nation states and their governments. So again, without going into too much detail, but some of the actor types that IR deals with, and this is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but some of the actor types that we deal with includes, first of all, state proxies. What do I mean by state proxies? Well, if you think of, for example, the Wagner Group, the private military company which effectively acts as an arm of the Russian state. Or another example, slightly different type of state proxy, but still a group which could be called a state proxy. If you think of Hezbollah primarily in Lebanon, or you think of Hamas in Gaza, those groups are arguably proxies of the Iranian state in some respects. So those are examples of state or state-backed proxy groups. Then we have Intergovernmental organisations, so the obvious example would be the United Nations and the various specialised agencies that sit under the United Nations, such as the World Health Organization or the Food and Agriculture Organization, for example, or the International Telecommunications Union. These are organisations which are made up of member governments, and they act as forums to facilitate interaction and cooperation between those governments to facilitate governance in a particular global issue area or in a range of global issue areas. Non-governmental organisations, NGOs, there are a huge variety of those. I mean, I'm sure you can think of lots off the top of your head. Groups like the Red Crescent, the Red Cross, groups like Amnesty International, groups like Greenpeace, for example. There are thousands of them. There are thousands of NGOs. The only thing that they all have in common is that, first of all, they operate at the global level, or at least the ones that we are interested in do. And secondly, they are not organised by governments. They are groups which are organised and operate separately from governments. So NGOs, very significant actors. Transnational corporations, big multinational companies, of course, are very, very important. They wield huge amounts of wealth and power. Many of the big multinationals, of course, are richer than many countries, and with the wealth that they control and the technology that they control and the access to that wealth and technology gives them a lot of political leverage, a lot of political power. So transnational corporations, again, very important actors on the world stage. We could include more sinister groups, like, for example, various terror and crime groups. Of course, what you call a terrorist or a terror group is to some extent a value judgment. You know, there is no single definition of terror and terrorism that everyone would agree on. And what we call a terrorist or we don't call a terrorist, to some extent, depends on our own point of view. But certainly armed groups which seek to use violence as a means of political, as a political lever. These groups are, as we know, very significant, not necessarily in terms of the actual military power they wield, because that's often quite minuscule, but in terms of the political effects that they have because of the fear that they can create. These groups have significant influence. Organised crime groups, which we can kind of separate from terrorist groups, in that organised crime groups generally operate for profit, for monetary profit, rather than for political ends. But again, still significant actors. And sometimes individuals as well. Sometimes individuals can have a significant impact on the world stage in various different ways. So we can think of perhaps religious leaders, spiritual leaders, intellectual, scholarly kind of figures, people who are activists in various different ways can have influence as well. So lots of different actors. States share the world stage these days. Perhaps they always did, but there's certainly more emphasis in present day international relations. There's more emphasis on non-state actors and more recognition of the roles that they play in international politics. Nonetheless, I think it's still fair to say that at this moment in time, we continue to live in a world made up of primarily of nation states. This is the basic unit of political organisation on planet Earth. There are, at last count, I think there was something like 195 sovereign states, 196 if we include Taiwan, although of course Taiwan is not widely recognised, largely for diplomatic reasons, but is a de facto state in most respects, even though it's not technically recognised as one. So yeah, there's really nowhere on planet Earth where you can go where you are not in the territory and under the jurisdiction of a nation state. This doesn't mean that states are necessarily permanent and fixed for all time. Again, had a little discussion with my students about that this week, because some of them come from a history background, and as such are kind of able to recognise that in the past different forms of political organisation have existed which maybe shared a lot of the features of a sovereign state, but weren't necessarily identical to a sovereign state as we understand it. And the thing that makes what we call a Westphalian sovereign state, the term comes, as I mentioned in the previous video, the term comes from the Treaty of Westphalia 1648, which is essentially established the modern concept of the nation state. The thing that makes a Westphalian nation state kind of different is the fact that states possess sovereignty. Now, what do we mean by sovereignty? Sovereignty, I guess, can be summed up as absolute and final authority, at least in theory, over a particular territory. I say at least in theory because there are, in actual fact, some limitations to sovereignty in practice. But at least in legal theory, a sovereign government has absolute power of life and death over its citizens. Within its own territory, it has, again, I keep saying, but at least in theory, it has unlimited power over, it can make any law it likes, it can decide who lives and who dies. But only within a given territory, and that's important as well. Nation states are defined by lines on a map. So every nation state has a piece of territory, and within that territory, within its own borders, the state has absolute jurisdiction. But the state's jurisdiction stops at its own border. So if I'm standing on the border between France and Germany, for example, I'm standing on the French side, I'm in French territory, I am under French jurisdiction and French law. The second that I step over the border, I'm now in German territory, under German jurisdiction and German law. France and French jurisdiction stops here, German jurisdiction starts at the same point. So states have mutually exclusive borders. Now that might seem a pretty obvious statement, but it has some pretty important implications, because this is kind of the limitation of the nation-state system. In an increasingly globalized world, nation-states really can't necessarily deal with a lot of the issues that require coordination at a global level. And there are lots and lots of those issues. The environment is a good one. Climate change is a good one. Things like international communications, things like the internet, making the internet work, for example, at a global level. And how to police the internet, how to deal with transnational crime, perhaps online crime which goes across international borders. So the victim is in the territory of one state and the perpetrator is in the territory of another state. How do you deal with stuff like that? And the nation-state system isn't actually well designed and well equipped to deal with these issues. So this is why I kind of say that ultimately nation-states are not they haven't always existed, and they may not always continue to exist in the future. We shouldn't make the mistake of assuming that states will always be there. There are other potential forms of political organisation, and perhaps one day we will see the Westphalian state system be superseded by something else. However, I don't think that's going to happen in the very near future. And for now, the nation state, with all of its limitations, remains the basic building block of the international system. The other core concept that I discussed with students this week is the idea of anarchy. Now, anarchy, again, students often get this wrong in actual fact when they're kind of first starting off in the subject. They think that anarchy is something to do with the anarchist movement, for example. We're not talking about anarchist politics, we're not talking about the anarchist movement, but rather we're talking about the concept of anarchy means essentially that no higher authority exists. Now, if we imagine for a moment, what would the world be like if there were no states? Just imagine for a moment that the state is no longer there. The law no longer exists. There's no longer an organised government. There's no longer a police force or any armed forces. There's no longer a judicial system. There's no longer any authority. And we as individual citizens are kind of left to fend for ourselves. And I asked my students, just as a kind of thought experiment, what do you think might happen under those conditions? If government disappeared tomorrow and all of the trappings of the state disappeared tomorrow, and there was no higher authority, what do you suppose might happen? And we had some interesting discussion around that, because some of the students said that, well, it will just be chaos, and basically people will just do whatever they want, and they'll be running around murdering each other and robbing from each other, and ultimately the strongest people around are going to be able to do what they want because there's no one to stop them. But some of the other students said, well, actually maybe we as citizens would create our own form of government, because recognising that without rules we're in a pretty bad situation, maybe we will be smart enough to organise ourselves and discuss among ourselves and come up with a set of rules and create order and create a state-like entity ourselves. So maybe we would be smart enough to realise that fighting each other and killing each other is not very productive, and that cooperation is the way forward. Now, I found those responses very interesting because they connect directly to the concept of anarchy in the international system, and connect also directly to two of the major paradigms on international relations theory. So, of course, at a kind of, at the citizen level, this is not the situation that we're in. There is a state, there is a government, there are laws, there is a police force, and we do have rule of law within a state. But if we think about the international level, there is no authority above and beyond the nation state. So if we think of the states now, instead of individual people, if we think of the states as being the actors, there is nothing above the authority of the sovereign state. Sovereignty by definition means the highest authority around. There is no higher authority. So states are not answerable to any higher authority. Now you might think, hang on a minute, what about the United Nations? What about international law? But the thing about the UN, the thing about international law, is that they are not sovereign in their own right. The UN is an organisation made up of its member governments. And the member governments agree among themselves. The UN is not a higher authority above nation states. It's a club made up of nation states. But within that club, each nation state, at least in theory, is equal and has an equal voice, and whatever decisions are made by the United Nations Security Council or whatever resolutions are passed by the General Assembly, those decisions, those resolutions are made through the agreement of UN member states. The same thing is true of international law. There is no international legislature, there is no world parliament making laws and imposing those on nation states. Rather, international law, such as it is created by mutual agreement among sovereign states. So effectively, at the world level, we have a situation of anarchy. We have no world government, we have no world police, we have no authority above and beyond that of the nation state. So what are the consequences of that? Well, much like, again, one group of my students who said that without authority, then it's just going to be chaos, it's going to be everyone fighting everyone else. One theoretical paradigm in IR, the realist perspective on international relations, says that essentially the world is very much like that. Realists say, look around the world, look at what's happening. The strongest states are doing what they want because there's no one to stop them. So if the United States wants to invade Iraq, if the United States wants to invade Afghanistan, as happened, just over 20 years ago, well, the United States can do that because it has the power to do that. Or more recently, if we look at Russia invading Ukraine, seizing Crimea, and then subsequently invading the rest of Ukraine, Russia can do that because Russia is a powerful actor. If we look at Israel and what Israel is doing in Gaza, for example, Israel, at least regionally, is a powerful actor, and of course is backed by a superpower, the United States. So arguably, Israel is able to get away with doing what it wants. So realists would say that's how the world is. The world is full of conflict and full of warfare, and because it all basically boils down to power politics. The biggest, strongest powers can do whatever they want, and competition between powerful actors inevitably leads to warfare. So quite a pessimistic view of the world, but realists say that they are not being pessimistic, they are being realistic, which is why they call themselves realists. But on the other hand, the liberal paradigm on international relations says that actually, if we look around the world, it's not all chaos and fighting all the time. Because actually, there's a lot more cooperation than there is fighting. If we look at, for example, if you want to get on a plane and fly to the other side of the world, you can fly across, a couple of dozen countries, and you're probably not going to get shot down. You may be very unlucky, it does sometimes happen, but for the most part, planes can fly across each other's airspace because there is a system which allows that. There are international agreements which allow that. There is a system of air traffic control which ensures that, ensures safety, basically ensures that planes can fly safely without crashing into each other and so on. And because there is that international system which has been agreed among nation states, air travel is perfectly safe. International trade takes place, and again, most of the time without any hitches. Occasionally there are, obviously there are trade disputes and, even things like acts of piracy sometimes, ships being hijacked, but that's pretty unusual. For the most part, international trade goes off. Yes, there are regulations, there are restrictions, but for the most part, international trade takes place, and as a result, the world is economically very interdependent. We can get on the internet, and the internet works. International communications work. Again, despite the fact that there is no world government, this doesn't preclude a system being created to allow international communications, which is why some of you will be in other countries. I'm here in the UK, but you can sit and watch this video because the internet works on a global level. That's just a few examples. So liberals would say actually there's lots of examples around the world of cooperation and collaboration between states. Fighting is not the norm. Yes, there is conflict in the world. Yes, there are power struggles in the world. But for the most part, most states are not fighting each other, and there's a lot of evidence of cooperation in the world. So again, coming back to the concept of anarchy, both realism and liberalism, both theoretical paradigms take anarchy as their starting point, but they disagree on what the consequences of anarchy are. Realists say anarchy inevitably leads to power struggles and conflict. Liberals say that anarchy doesn't have to lead to that, and that despite anarchy, states can learn to cooperate with one another and can build order out of chaos, if you like. Okay, so that pretty much brings me to the end of what I wanted to cover this week. So again, these are just a few of the core concepts that we need to kind of have straightened out before we kind of talk about IR theory proper. So think about the actors in global politics. Be sure that you understand the concept of a Westphalian nation state and the idea of sovereignty, which is what makes a state a state. Sovereignty, again, a key underlying principle. It's the key ordering principle in the world as we know it today. The Westphalian sovereign nation state is the basic building block and the most important actor in world politics. Not the only actor, but the basic political building block of the world. But also the concept of anarchy. Important concept to grasp because it is the starting point for a great many of the IR theoretical perspectives that we will be looking at over the next few weeks. Okay, so I hope you found that video useful, and again, time permitting, hopefully I'll be able to upload a follow-up video next week which will start to look at the realist perspective on international relations. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.